Hi people, it's Sarkavist here, and today I'm reviewing Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. When I heard that Respawn Entertainment were going to be taking gameplay cues from that of From Software's titles such as Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, a game which I absolutely loved earlier in the year, I was incredibly excited, and indeed when I first saw the initial trailer for this game, although a lot were underwhelmed, I saw that spark of brilliance in terms of the combat where rather than being able to overpower your enemies with the Force, instead it took actual brain power and nuance to be able to take them down. And indeed, playing the game for myself, I have realised that that is exactly how the game plays, and I am a massive fan of this one. And although there was a lot of talk before the game came out about how great it was that we were getting a single player Star Wars experience without any microtransactions or potential DLC, that wasn't really what I cared about. It was more about what is this game actually going to play like, and I don't think it's fair either to purely give a game points for that, even though of course it is a benefit. But if I just take a step back and judge this game for what it is rather than for what it's not, it is still a fantastic experience, although it isn't flawless. There are some issues with this game which we will get to, but I want to focus on what I love most about the game first, and that is without a doubt the combat. I love the combat in this game, and I say this as someone who, wow, over a decade now was a massive fan of The Force Unleashed, a comparison I make because it was another single-player Star Wars experience that focused on a Force wielder. But in that game you of course played as a Sith, and in that game you used incredible Force powers to simply overwhelm your enemies. You saw 6 stormtroopers and you just Force pushed them out the way, or you would apply Force lightning to an AT-ST, right? There was nothing that could stand in your way. It was just about using your Force powers, and although that was fun, it wasn't especially skillful, right? But I suppose that's in playing with what we consider to be Sith and Jedi. But in this game, it is all about the skill. It's all about the nuance and about the ability to react, anticipate, and predict what your opponent is going to do. And in reality, when you first play this game, that will make it a little bit tricky. You won't know exactly when an opponent is about to strike. Even if it's telegraphed, it takes time to build up that timing. And when you begin to master this game, and when I say master, it's mostly about understanding the attack patterns of individual enemies, because even those which, when you first fight them, can seem a little bit unfair and a little bit cheap, the more I began to engage them, the more I began to realise they did all have at least one form of weakness, even if I had to get more Force powers in order to expose that weakness. And it's only really now, having finished the game, that I realised that, because going through, I will say 100%, there were certain enemies that I thought were just cheap, but by fighting them over and over and over again, I began to unearth the predictability of their attack patterns, and I loved that because it completely harkens back to Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, although it does not have the same difficulty level by default. If you play this game on the default normal difficulty level, it feels very fair, very approachable, and it's not going to put anyone off. So if these comparisons to Dark Souls have made you feel that perhaps this isn't a very accessible Star Wars game, I would say don't worry about that whatsoever. I think anyone can really pick this game up and enjoy it. Maybe some persistence will be required on certain boss fights, but on the whole, you can overcome this game. It's nothing compared to Sekiro on its default difficulties, but for those looking for a greater challenge, and I will admit I've only played the game for a little bit on this setting, you can ramp it up quite a bit, but be warned, it is legitimately quite tricky. One thing I will say though, and maybe it's more personal preference, but I feel as if the game put me up against beast type enemies too much. I really enjoy fighting stormtroopers and melee opponents, but when I had to fight beasts, I don't know, it wasn't quite as satisfying for whatever reason. I wish I could really put a critical component to that, but honestly, maybe it's just me. I like fighting stormtroopers, I like fighting other Sith or Fallen Jedi. Fighting beasts, it's just not really for me, and there was quite a lot of it. There's also a platforming component to the game, and at first I was very much in favour of this because I feel as if not enough games focus on the agility of a Jedi, even though agility is meant to be one of the major advantages of being a Jedi. They can jump much higher, they can move much quicker, but I think it got to a point where it felt too easy almost, and almost like it was padding the game out. Like I would be climbing along a ledge and I'm just thinking, there's nothing really happening here. There's nothing I'm really doing. So although at first I like the platforming, in the end it got a little bit, I wasn't particularly fond of it. Also, there are some technical issues with the game. The frame rate is okay, but it's not perfect. And I think the reason it stutters sometimes is probably because of the streaming system this game has, where if you're moving from one part of the map into another, it can hitch for a bit. I don't suspect that's because of GPU load. I think it's because of data being streamed from the hard drive into memory. And where this became actually a problem was when I was downloading something in the background on my Xbox, and it seemed to overload the streaming system for the game to the point where I went into a level and it just wouldn't load. I was just there looking at this massive expanse of nothing. It was about 2/3 into the game and literally the level would not load, and I had to reboot my Xbox. It still had a problem, and I came back to it later and mysteriously it was working, and I suspect it was because this game cannot handle the IO being shared between this and something else. That's just my analysis of it. But on the whole, it's okay. It's not what I would call a buggy game in the same way that maybe you would call a Bethesda game a buggy game, but it's not quite rock solid. I almost feel as if the game could have taken a bit longer to refine, and indeed I definitely hope that they will patch the game in a few areas to make sure it is rock solid, because at the moment it is good, it is strong, but it's lacking a little bit. It almost feels like you're playing a very late early access game. Like it's almost ready to be launched, but it's just lacking that final stage of refinement. And that's mostly, again, I think to do with the streaming and the loading system the game has. Graphically, in some areas it can look really nice, in other areas it can look a little bit bland. It's also got a 30 FPS lock, and I suppose, although on the whole I probably overall prefer this game to the Battlefront games, they did look a lot nicer under Frostbite. That's not to say that Frostbite would have been an appropriate engine for this game, but in terms of immediate first impressions, I definitely think that Star Wars Battlefront 2 is a better looking game and a better running game than this. But that's not to say Frostbite should have been used, because I don't know that it could handle the parkour mechanics, but it is the reality of how the game looks. It's not quite as good looking as Star Wars Battlefront 2, unfortunately. In terms of the narrative, I don't want to spoil anything, but I will just give you a general sense of it. It's very thematically similar to that of Rogue One. I felt as if the characters were handled in a similar way to Rogue One, in that although you do have heroes, there's something about them that's flawed, something about them that's not necessarily super heroic. And also, the way the game ends, and you'll get this when you come to it, ends in a familiar way, shall we say. I don't want to say anything more than that, but yeah, I got some vibes there. It's also got some similarities to Star Wars Rebels, but that's mostly just to do with the fact that the Inquisitors are a major part of the story. Also, speaking of the Inquisitors, unfortunately I don't have footage here, but the fight sequences with the Inquisitors are absolutely stand out, right? They are fantastic, and I know I'm going backwards towards combat here, but the lightsaber fights in this game, in my personal opinion, are unparalleled in terms of how they play and how they look. They are so far from that of Star Wars Battlefront 2, when it's mostly just mashing and blindly firing false abilities. They are fantastic, and they offer a decent challenge even on the moderate difficulty levels, so that is fantastic. So yeah, this is a game that I think is not quite perfect, but I am so glad it exists, and I had an absolute blast playing it. A few things that could have been improved, maybe less parkour. I didn't really mention it, but maybe, I want to say a bit less puzzle elements, but you know what, that's really personal preference. Some people might enjoy the puzzles in the game. But the combat is such a strong step in the right direction, and I wholeheartedly hope that Respawn get another shot at it, because I think if they get another shot at this style of gameplay, then they can completely iron out all the small issues and just focus on what made this game great. So, as always, people, thanks very much for watching, and see you next time.
I think he's calling it quits. Don't let up. I'm sure we'll beat you.